Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we're going to speak about Kurds. Kurdish people are stateless people. It sounds very harsh to say that, but Kurds were promised a state after World War I and defeat of the Ottoman Empire. The victorious Western Allies made provision for Kurdish state in the 1920 Treaty of Sevres. However, that promise was broken 3 years later by the Treaty of Lausanne, leaving Kurds with minority status in all of the new countries, Turkey, Iraq and Syria. When adding Iran, there are approximately 45 million Kurds living in those 4 countries, but also elsewhere in the world. So how can we understand Kurds in international relations? That's the primary question for today, and we're going to answer that question with our expert, Marianna Charountaki. Hello, Marianna.
Thank you for having me.
Marianna Charountaki is a senior lecturer in international politics at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. Her research focuses on international relations theories, foreign policy analysis, and area studies with emphasis on the Middle Eastern region. She is author of 2 books related to Kurds. The first one is The Kurds and the US Foreign Policy, International Relations in the Middle East since 1945. And the second book is Iran and Turkey, International and Regional Engagement in the Middle East. There is also a publication, the latest publication, and that's the Non-State Actors and Foreign Policy Agency Insight from Area Studies, edited by Marianna Charountaki, Christos Kortelis and Daniela Herrera. So let's speak about the Kurds and their international engagement. And my first question is, what was the impact of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 on the international status of the Kurdish Regional Government? And maybe, Marianna, you can say a few words about what that government means for international relations of Kurds.
Thank you for the question. I think that going back to 2003, it's a landmark not only for the development of the Kurdish status in the Middle East, but for the Middle East as a whole. Most of the times we really stick to 2010 and the Arab uprisings as I call them, but in reality, this goes far beyond that. It goes back to 2003, I guess, and the regime change. The status of the Kurds, at least as far as the Kurds in Iraq is concerned, it was already created back in 1992. However, I think that 2003 was an instance that consolidated even further their presence, proved that the Kurds can play the role of partners, equal partners in this project that initially thought to be understood as democratization or as a project of the broader development of the region. And in a way, I guess they contributed to the change in Iraq, which, of course, the way and the ways that this was handled later on, I think it's a separate story from that very moment of 2003. In general, I want to say here in a small parenthesis that when we are talking about the region, either we talk about the Kurds or any other entity, it's a very important contribution to the broader literature, because theory cannot survive abstractedly from practice, and obviously all these different regional examples, they do need a conceptual frame in order to be able and understand better terms and broader meanings. But overall, I think that the Kurds per se constitute a case study that has somehow contributed to the abolishment of mainstream assumptions as far as the international relations is concerned. And in this respect, I think that this is a valuable case, that it's not only, I think, in practice contributes to what we call Middle Eastern politics, but as an intrinsic part of, obviously, but even more on the theory itself, That's why when I think we are working on what we call Kurdish cases is not a thing, an abstract thing on its own, right? Not at all. It's a very important, I think, contribution that has helped us revise and revisit the international relations discipline. So in this sense, I'm very glad that I'm able to contribute on my own right to the development of the Kurdish studies, especially on the international relations level that has not been traditionally, at least when I started, it has not been really happened much on the theoretical level.
Can we say a few words about how people understand Kurds? Do people understand Kurds as a nation or as an ethnic group or civilization or how?
Discussing about the Kurds. Personally, as a scholar, I'm more interested in their political sort of side. But all the life, I think, of the average Kurd is a stance of a political position, given, of course, that they are fragmentation into four different countries: Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. But also we find Kurds in Russia, in all these former Soviet republics, and so forth. So culturally, we are talking about an indigenous population that it never inhabited as an external force, any sort of territory. We're talking about a nation with 4,000 years of civilization. So in these respects, we are talking about an indigenous local population, but obviously because of the politics, and these are well known, I think, historical realities, because of the politics of the region following the 1920s, San Remo Conference, Sykes-Picot Agreement, fragmented into different entities. In any way, the Middle East is an artifact, is artificial as far as its borders is concerned. That's why today is very interesting that we are seeing, and we continue to see, the developments in the Middle Eastern region discussing about borders when these have been based on an artificial basis in any way. I think above everything, the only let's say victim of the broader regional international politics, just obviously the population that they are victimized for the sake of power politics.
How has Turkey's response to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, insurgency in the late 90s and 2000s shaped its foreign relations, particularly with the NATO allies?
This is a very interesting, I think, question, because we shouldn't forget, first and foremost, that the period of the 1990s was, I could even characterize it a PKK decade. And this is the case because most of the security happenings, most of the security meetings, most of the developments back then when it comes to Turkey, to Syria, and so forth, they were really taking place on the basis of what we are going to do about the PKK. That, of course, it started its direct involvement in regional politics since 1984. But it's also funny, I think, to reflect on this question, because we shouldn't forget that the capture of Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK's leadership back in 1999, February, as far as I can recall, and as later was supported by Abdullah Öcalan himself, was a NATO plan, with, of course, the aid of support of certain regional agencies. So 1991, we have the capture of Abdullah Öcalan. By itself, I think this was another landmark for regional politics that initially it did not blow any, it didn't have any sort of negative blow in the movement as far as I think we were able to witness, but on the contrary, from 2000 we see an empowered movement that this was also reflected into their conference back in 2000 with certain, I think, decisions and maybe a determination, regardless of later on this was materialized or not, a determination to materialize the third and last goal of its program, which was basically the politicization of their objectives, of the cause, if you like. Yes. It was the beginning of the 2000s. I think it was more important for the PKK and its trajectory than before. I think that was a critical moment that if it could be exploited in a very positive way, I think it would have maybe even the opposite results from what is going on today. But again, we are talking about an ongoing, complicated situation. So it was a very critical moment, I think, more the 2000s rather than the 1990s for the progress of the movement, which of course would have positive outcomes and results for regional politics as well, because we shouldn't forget, and I think everybody, regional scholars and so forth, share the same view that the Middle East is particular only because of its interrelational synthesis. We are talking about interrelated complexities or interrelated relations. That's why it makes it difficult for the decision making to be able and maybe come up with long-term solutions.
And what about the Turkish and Kurdish regional government relation today? Like, how has it evolved, and what sort of changes can you see or can you tell us about?
I would like to start a little bit general and then be more specific. In general, I would like to say that I would not call it mistake, but I would say that it's not safe if we try to extract conclusions by focusing on incidents. And I think this is a practice, a very common practice. Focusing on incidents does not mean and does not give in any way long-term understanding about the nature, the real, in inverted or not, the real nature of regional relations. I will give you a very small example, and then I will come back, of course, to your question. Back in 2011, 2011-12, it was very interesting because we know that since 2008 we can talk safely about institutionalized and direct relations between the Kurdistan Regional Government and Ankara. It's very interesting that we have a period 2011-2012 where Baghdad is accusing basically Turkey for its hostile regional policies about a sort of direct interference in Iraqi affairs. We had back then Davutoglu's official visit to Erbil, and if I'm not mistaken, afterwards to Kirkuk, maybe on 1st, 2nd of August 2012, to discuss Syrian Kurdish affairs with the Kurdish leadership without prior notification to the Iraqi foreign minister. Then these led to further events when the chair of the National Movement Party denied a visa to visit Kirkuk by Baghdad and so on. But all these do not prevent the directions that today, for instance, Iraqi-Turkish relations are currently taking. So it means that everything can be subject to change. However, this does not give a safe, maybe a safe stance to talk about permanent close or relations. When it comes to Turkey and the KRG, the practice has witnessed that we have, as I said, the start of direct and institutionalized relations since 2008, and today, if this is what we are talking about, I think they are reaching a peak without precedents, because I do believe that today we are talking about closer relations than ever before. We shouldn't forget that on the energy sector, maybe we can come back to this, Genel Energy, the contract with Turkey back in 2012, from 2012 onwards, was really the starting point when really the gate opened for the KRG to be able and being active in the oil sector. So Turkey has been either this is it has been willing or not, but in reality, it has been, I think, the starting point and all these trajectory as far as the energy sector and the KRG is concerned. And the same thing we can argue back in 1992, because obviously back then of the humanitarian crisis and the influx of the refugees on the borders, I think it was a necessity that either it was willing or not, either Turkey knew what it would follow or not, that we had actually the beginning that showed the seeds for the creation of the KRG from 1992. Overall, when it comes to the Turkish and KRG relations and any relations that I think they are connected with borders, I think it's we end up talking, and in any way we end up talking about interdependence in the world nowadays, but even more when we're talking about direct relations that really they are marked by a borderline. It's impossible that we can talk about weaker or we can talk about stronger partners when on the grounds, of course, we're talking about this direct sort of neighborhood, and maybe the, if you like, proof of that has been the most recent Iranian KRG rapprochement, a very intense interaction that we had not really witnessed that in the past many years. And of course, regional realities are pushing entities that are marked by border lines to be, to that extent, interdependent, and it does not matter if we talk about state or non-state entities.
Let's go back to Iraq. And I'm interested in 2017, there was a Kurdish independence referendum. So how this affected the Kurds in Iraq?
I have written on the Kurdistan referendum, referendum non-state actors, an article that I published by the Cambridge Review International Affairs. In practice, it is true that this was an excuse, possibly, so that the Kurds would not any longer, at least on their own, safeguard parts of the disputed territories. It's true that this affected the economic sector that the KRG up until that time was blooming. And it is true that there was a very intense discussion about whether this needed to take place or not. I am skeptical as to whether, with or without the referendum, the same outcomes would have been the case. The referendum in itself was a unilateral decision, and at the same time, it was and it has been a prerequisite of the 2006 Constitution, on the basis of which the Constitution would be considered as valid. Of course, that referendum should have happened overall in the whole of Iraq, which until today this has not been the case. So it had not, I think, the referendum in itself consequences, but I think regional politics will lead to a state of affairs that possibly such consequences could have happened in any way. As you know very well, the reactions, the management of any sort of crisis lies in the will always of the federal government in such a sort of cases. So I believe back then, if the federal government would be willing to sit in a table of negotiations, as it happened so many times before, even under Saddam and so forth, and say that, okay, maybe we don't agree in A, B, C, D, and we will not accept the results of this referendum as unilateral, or if any other sort of arrangement could have taken place, I guess nothing maybe would have happened on the military level from what maybe it followed later on. In any way, it remains a thing of fact and has been historically recorded, the will of this disputed, of the will of the citizenship, the will of the people in the Kurdistan region, but also in the disputed territories, at least back then, that they would have preferred to be administrated by Erbil rather than Baghdad. And this was something which was, I guess, recorded because overall the referendum was more about that. It was more about administration, I think, rather than secession on its own right, separation on its own right. At least this is how I understood it. The interesting thing, in order to conclude here, and I'm referring this to my article, was that back then it was never mentioned the separate proposal that the KRG had offered vis-a-vis the self-rule, the autonomous status within, if that would be the case, the Kurdistan of these disputed territories, and this was not something that it was either debated or it was thought, or it was from the media, it was sort of like demonstrated. Normally in these cases, and through media, it's more easy to pose yes or no questions and basically not to invest really time in order to discuss about issues that, of course, they have consequences on the ground. So we are wasting sometimes more time in a yes or no answer, in very brief sort of impressions, rather than on matters that they need a more accurate sort of analysis. And I think we have reached the point that in the Middle East, because we're talking about the Middle East, we have, and overall, we have to overcome taboos. Taboos is not any longer, I think, the case, and nothing is really any longer sensitive, given the fact that everyone is talking with everyone. Talking about really direct relations among any of all those entities that comprise today the Middle East. So any sort of sensitivity, I think, is just only taboo nowadays, or dichotomies among the nature of the nature of the entities that we are talking about, the nature of their status, and we can see here how today this is proven more than ever before. Everybody participates in the formulation of politics. So, yeah, I think it was exaggerated. Of course, the outcomes for the Kurds themselves were not positive at all. However, we saw that around 6, 7, 8 months after, the Ministry of Energy from the US administration was there together with President Masoud Barzani discussing and so forth. So in the end of the day, I think it's about the management of the events rather than sometimes of the gravity of the events on their own right. But of course, it is a historical paper that I think the Kurds could use for future politics and in their negotiations.
What about the relations with United States and European Union and maybe Great Britain? Because we know that Kurds played a very important role when the ISIS was basically in all media and all headlines. It was 2014, 2019, that sort of period of time. So what can you say about the impact of the involvement of Kurds in fight against terrorism and the relations with the Western powers?
We go back now to all these points that we raised so far, how really an entity is important on its own right, intrinsically important, and it's very interesting when it's convenient, it can be given the gravity that it owns, and other times to be played as this other actor that, well, it does not satisfy certain criteria and characteristics. That's why, before I answer to your question, I try when I created this typology in this book that we did on the non-state actors, I try somehow to categorize all those different, let's say, non-state entities in the Middle East so that exactly we don't throw everyone into the same basket. And when I discussed about these states to be a category where we find cases like the KRG or like the Kurdistan region, in other words, or the PLO and so forth, Palestine, and so forth, of course, it's very normal not necessarily to be liked, but it was understood, and they are understood, these states to be as entities with state attributes and an ability to adjust the status quo, that is to drive or shape the process of development in an effort to preserve or maybe consolidate their power base and self-governance. So it's not a matter of outcome per se. So in this context, when we are talking about such an important entities that they play increasingly important, we come here with this question and your example to say that a non-state army, the Peshmerga in Iraq, of a non-state, obviously, entity, because if it was a state, nothing of all this would be discussed and we will not be talking. The Kurdistan region, it stand, and it was, I think, very sort of obvious and accepted from the so-called international community view that they have been the forefront in the global war against terrorism. And the Peshmerga, per se, were part of the anti-ISIS coalition, a very important partner in this effort to battle terrorism, in particular ISIS. Now, this was the moment that I think the Kurdistan presidency back then thought that we are offering so much for this international community, in a sense that everybody agrees that we are fighting on behalf of the world, that maybe it's our also right to claim certain demands within this same context that we are living in, without altering, the borders per se. And I think that was the incentive back then of the referendum as well, that, hey, we have done and we did so much back in the 2003, back in 2014, and so forth. Even further back, through victimization because of the genocide that has been committed against us, and so forth. That now maybe it's the time for certain further recognition based on concrete proposal and plans that, as we said, they were never discussed. So I think that was the incentive. And of course, if either we talk about the regime change policy in Iraq or we talk about the war against ISIS and so forth, the Kurds remained the only staunch ally, but not only of the US. You know very well that the Kurds have developed good relations with Russia. Going back to the initial question, and given the fact that obviously the Kurds in Iraq, they were not the only ones that they fought on behalf of the whole of the world, terrorism, but equally the Kurds in Syria as well. They were basically the main partner in the liberation of certain territories along with the US. So on the grounds, in reality, the US found as an only ally the Kurds in Syria. And it's interesting how possibly there was an abandonment back to 2015. And then we had the occupation of the territories in Syria by Turkey. So discussing about the impact of the Kurds overall on the EU or on the US foreign policies and so forth, of course, we understand that it is not the same when it comes to the US and the Kurdistan region, but also the part that we call Rojava Kurdistan, the administration in Kurdistan administration in Syria, even though it's more sort of it consists of more obviously than one entity, one ethnic entity. They have been main allies of the US. However, and of course, they have exercised impact on the formulation of the US foreign policy at the same time that they have been impacted, which is more natural, by the US. However, in the case of the EU as a foreign policy actor, and at the same time as an actor that is consisted of 27 member states, I could not argue that it is the same. Yes, the EU has issued statements and so forth vis-à-vis human rights in relation to the Kurds in Turkey, but other than that, I don't really think that the EU policies have affected dramatically in any way the trajectory of Kurdish politics in either of these countries, of these states. What is interesting, though, and I think here we need to focus, is the upgrade, the elevation of the role of the KRG in the table of negotiation within the EU, and I'm talking about the separate, basically, seat that they hold along with Baghdad in the negotiations, in the discussions with the EU. I think this is a very important development that, as far as I can see now, it's progressing. But I don't think that, apart from obviously particular member states such as France, that they have played a critical role in Kurdish politics. Overall, I can say that the EU as an entity per se have not been really particularly active, but not only when it comes to Kurdish politics. I think overall in the Middle East, we have not seen any sort of noticeable impact that we could maybe argue that the EU is taking even more seriously its role as an EU actor. As an EU foreign policy actor, other than obviously the institution and itself as an entity. To conclude, I would like to argue here that it's very important today that we are able to witness these interactive relations between the EU as a foreign policy actor, the European Union, the Union, and the KRG, it tells us a lot about the theory. It has a huge impact on the theoretical level, but in practice, we have seen this sort of rapprochement, if you like, or a more sort of in-depth relationship with the Kurdistan region only because of the Kurdish referendum back in 2017. One, if you like, of the positive impacts that the referendum have had, but we would link this more obviously to the regional developments and competitors on the ground, external competitors on the ground, rather than on the issue per se. When it comes to the EU foreign policy, we can possibly only argue that the EU has never really preoccupied, as maybe some scholars have written, with the so-called Kurdish issue, if you like, per se. It has not been the case. At the same time, it has not particularly preoccupied with the Kurds overall. Yes, with the human rights in Turkey vis-a-vis the Kurds, and maybe there is a willingness to be found a solution in this context and case. But right now, I think we can claim that the only Kurdish entity where safely we can argue that the EU foreign policy has developed, apart from the relations of percent, of course, if you have relations, you need to have a policy. But it has, it's only with the KRG. So we're talking about an EU Kurdish policy, yes, in the case of the KRG. And I think nowadays this is declared based obviously on the interactive relations they are happening even within the Gulf of the Union in itself. So I think this is a very important development. And in the last book that we did, I have also a contribution on that in the KRI and EU interactive relations. And it's very interesting, and maybe this can be hopeful, maybe for the future, if it is the case that EU, European Union, at last can move from a reactive, if you like, stance and policy to a more proactive as an important partner in international politics, given, of course, its stance in the Ukraine-Russian matter and so forth. So when you claim, when you want to claim actorhood, you need to consolidate this through particular specific practices, positions, and so forth.
Marianna, we mentioned energy in some way. Then we mentioned more partners and actors. And some people might wonder, what is the relations between Baghdad and Kurds? Because Kurds are exporting oil. And this oil is being exported for Turkey, as I am not mistaken. So this is sort of interesting constellations of international relations. So what can we say about Kurds and Baghdad at the present time?
I think it's this is the most important, interesting question. It's the question of the million, billion, trillion dollars.
Therefore, you are here.
So
yeah.
And this is because I think that right now, regardless of the intentions, regardless of the determination, regardless of the will of both sides, the reality is one. Given the perpetual turmoil in the Middle East, I would dare to say and argue that right now maybe Iraq is the only constitutionally functioning to any extent entity that has been left in the heart of the Middle East. This is obviously something to consider if we want to go back to 2012, maybe labels about the oasis and who is the oasis in the Middle East and how we are going to preserve a balance of power, peace, stability, and so forth, because this is how everything started throughout all these different engagements. So right now, today, because Syria is still in a very sort of pending status. In the heart of the Middle East, we find Iraq consisted of three components. Obviously, there is a particularly powerful dynamic in the case of the Kurds and the Shia in Baghdad. This means that responsibility lies upon both entities to be able and coexist, regardless obviously of traumatic and historical sort of realities. It's true, I think, that today the solution when it comes to Iraq, when we're talking about unity, when we're talking about coexistence, and I guess it does not really matter in which frame this is going to happen. It doesn't matter if Iraq is a federalism. It doesn't matter if Iraq is a confederalism. What it matters is if we are able to see concrete steps that they should be taken only by the forces within in order to reach certain solutions, because obviously salaries, pending salaries, unpaid salaries is the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg is related to what sort of relations, what kind of relations we want to have if we want to call ourselves a unified Iraq. And I repeat, it does not matter the frame, the mode of governance that you are able to do this. And here again, we have these taboos and the characterizations, the negative sort of stereotypical things about confederalism and so forth. Confederalism is a very viable, I guess, model, and maybe the only way forward in the case of Iraq right now. And the Kurdistan presidency, as well as maybe certain components within Iraq, they are very much, I think, they have very much argued about the need for unity. Not any external actor, not any other mediator are able to solve these the pending problems between Erbil and Baghdad. For sure, we are talking about prolonged issues. It's not something current that it is happening, but and it's very interesting that now we are finalizing a book with Belgrade because of the century of state making in the case of Iraq. Clearly, we're talking about a process in progress. However, this does not mean that we should really abandon any sort of hopes. The key here, obviously, is the regional interference in the case of Iraq, even more than the international. The withdrawal of institutions of EU, UN, whoever else, I don't think it helps really, and it is the key in having healthy bilateral relations. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance that Iraq holds traditionally. We have, I think, to show kind of compassion in the fact that we're talking about an entity that is in a constant state of war, 30, 40 years on and off. So this, as you understand, prohibits progress, development. And I believe that if we are talking about sincere partners, that they want to work in favor of Iraq, either this is called Kurdistan region, this is called Baghdad, still, I guess all the components, they are on the same boat. The point and the problem, I think, is the projection of all those interests and all those, Iraqi or not, that they work in favor of any other entity other than Iran. So prioritization, I think, of the relationship from within for themselves as well, I think now is a number one top priority. And I think, if you ask me, regardless about what is now going on in the Middle East, when it comes to Iraq, I think this is the top issue today. Maybe it's not about oil, maybe it's not about economy, it's not about salaries, it is about how really relations can be fixed with a long-term vision, but this necessitates politicians, political personas that they have this experience and capability, and maybe figures, especially in Baghdad, that they can prevail, and they have actually the acceptance and the recognition both of all these others within, because in the case of Iraq, I think it's important if you have the recognition of the rest of the citizenship and also the political system, but also from the outside. I think this guarantees a smooth transition to something maybe better, but of course the resolution of any pending issues that again go back to the very nature, to the very kind of this relationship. It's, I think, should be the top priority. But you need political figures, political personas that they are from politics, they have this political background, that they are able to pursue all these different tasks rather than people coming from the military, from here, from there, irrelevant personalities that can only maybe fuel the fire.
There is another actor that we must mention when we speak about the Middle East, and that's Russia. So how would you characterize, or what would you say about Russia's engagement with the Kurdish forces in Syria since 2015, and how this affected Kurdish-Russian relations? And
Yes.
as you know, the war in Ukraine is developing in some direction. So this geopolitics is very dynamic. So I fully understand that this question is not easy to answer, but perhaps we can say a few main things so our viewers can better understand this situation.
I'll take the risk. Talking about, I think, Russia foreign policy, it's something very interesting, particularly from 2011, March 2011 onwards, because either we like it or not, the Syrian crisis opened the gate. And since then, we talk about the re-entry of Russia into global affairs, into regional politics, into international politics in a very dynamic and concrete way. The fact, I think, that the Russian foreign policy had somehow concrete and determined sort of like goals, but more importantly, stable alliances, maybe justify even more why they were able in this turbulent time to preserve their status in the Middle East. When it comes to the Kurds, of course, if we discuss about the Kurds in Syria, I think it must have been a bitter experience, especially from 2015 onwards, when the US, let's say, abandonment was characterized, I think, or was perceived maybe negatively by the Russians, because obviously by then the Kurds, only because they had basically been in contact and so forth, they were, I think, characterized, perceived as maybe Western. So I think this somehow caused mistrust, and maybe Russia could have done on the grounds much more in terms of its alliance with Rojava Kurdistan, which clearly did not happen. Traditionally, I think Russian foreign policy discourse was to somehow recognized as legitimate and so forth, only because in its core was found this support in favor of human rights, in favor of kind of equilibrium of power, where you are not being really the weak and someone else is strong. But I'm afraid that there has to be revisit, a reconsideration, and maybe more sort of skeptical self-assessment when it comes to these ideological parameters, the West, the anti-West, the acts of resistance, and so forth. Because in reality, either we like it or not, there are certain powers, especially after its re-entry, like Russia, like the US, and regardless, obviously, of any sort of ebbs and flows, ups and downs, that they have a particularly strong saying when it comes to the formulation of politics, obviously, because of their strength, warfare, and so forth. That it should not also, the governments, the administration should not also underestimate themselves. I understand this sort of like broader division of the world that echoes somehow the Cold War period into sort of alliances, which of course might be acceptable, but I think we shouldn't lose ourselves into mere ideological and to some extent stereotypical departures from where then only chaos really can follow. I think the pragmatic understanding of a survival of the whole of a setting, the whole of the system is far more important, I think, than the survival of one with no other competitors, and thus citizenship, and thus land, and thus territory, and thus people. So I think major powers need to reconsider its foreign policy discourse beyond the practice. And I think the case of the Kurds in Syria back in 2015-17, was really a replication of past experiences that it does not suit contemporary politics. So obviously every entity decides upon its own alliances and so forth. But I think the criteria, to some extent, they have to be revisited and rethought, because then we are led to dead ends with no, I think, value for any entity involved. And I'm talking about entity because I'm not just talking about, obviously, here state entities. So right now, Russia is preserving its relations with the Kurdistan region. And I think traditionally, the foreign policy stance of Russia justifies very well these sort of like interactive relations with entities like the Kurds, because interdependence, I think it's a factor that should not be neglected, even in times of glory, especially in the case of the Middle East, that the ebbs and flows are part of the process in anyhow, and everything is changing in a matter of seconds. So this responsibility that lies, as I said before, with federal governments, that obviously they have in the field of decision making a bit sort of more leverage, or on the global level, the responsibility that lies with major actors rather than those that they have limited, if you like, choices. I think it's something which needs to be considered by the decision-making bodies in each of these entities.
Marianna, when we speak about Kurds, there are always questions about human rights. And I would like to maybe blend a few questions into one question, and that's the crackdown on Kurdish political parties and the arrest of Abdullah Öcalan in 1999. These are the events that we know about. But what was the response of the international community to those events? And has this response changed within the years in terms of recognizing Kurds in a sort of more sophisticated way since that time?
I think that this sort of like stance of recognitions versus legitimacy and so forth is very much relevant. When we are talking about, we tend to use the term international community, but who is the international community? We always have to be very specific in how we perceive and how we describe abstraction. So obviously we're not talking about the average citizen, we're talking about specific institutions. And as you can see, institutions are today silent relatively to some extent, even in all those different sort of developments that they are going through, that the region is going through the past years until today, and somehow they supersede even the power of those collectivities. And we see how, again, somehow we go back to this sort of like Hobbesian Leviathan state of nature, where you have the prevalence of specific actors, and these sort of combinations every time is subject to change, that they are able to make decisions. So I don't think that either we talk about Palestinians or we talk about the Kurds and so forth. Holistically, such a will is being observed. No. In the case of Iraq, I think there is an epitome that is not been really found in the rest of the examples that you mentioned. That's why, for me, they're not Kurds, they're not Palestinians. We're talking about the Kurds in Iraq. We're talking, for example, the Kurdistan region. We're talking about the Kurds in Turkey. And this is the case because each of these entities have been shaped by the characteristics of the context, of the environment, of the structure that they have been surrounded by. But what you are saying, it would maybe indicate signs of going forward. And I'm wondering, is our world today going forward when the same sort of conflicts, the same sort of nature of conflict is taking place for half century? And I'm a little bit, skeptical if we are going forwards or not. I'm sorry, I didn't finish what I wanted to say. So when we go back to the Kurds of Iraq, we're talking about now a constitutionally recognized entity. This is a very big achievement. It's a huge, actually, achievement. But this is not the case when we talk about, for example, the Kurds in Iran. So I'm not sure if our international community, it's not an abstract thing. We're talking about certain institutions and individuals within institutions that they're making decisions. I'm not sure that we have reached these levels of progress, and thus this condition where we can say that holistically, yes, we talk about the recognition of 40 million, of 30 or 50. At the same time, we witness cases like, for example, Northern Macedonia, that a state without common language, without a common nationality and so forth, they are being created in one night. So all these phenomena, to some extent, they should problematize both politicians, but also scholars. We are not at too speedy level world here because of this interdependency. It's impossible single entity to be able and survive alone. Either this is the US or this is the EU or this is Russia alone. Everyone is in need of alliances, coalitions, partnerships, in order to be able to ensure survival. It's too complex, the world for that. And still, in 2024, we are talking about basic prerequisite rights. Yes, it's a failure of our world, of course.
Right. Can we touch a little bit Syria again? Because I think Syria is very complicated. in terms of what's going on in Syria and what does Syria mean in 2024. And we know about the Battle of Kobani and Syrian Kurdish political movement. So when we say Kurds in Syria, what does it mean in 2024 in terms of their autonomous living?
There is obviously an obvious complication. The complication starts with the ongoing situation that it is not definite. There is lots of abstraction. For me, it's an ongoing, if you like, state of transition.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear, I think, from the very beginning, from maybe those that they were following more closely politics in the region, that Bashar al-Assad, as it was initially perceived and believed, it had nothing to do really with all these other different examples, Libya and so forth. And this is pretty much the same because of the domestic realities in Syria, but also because the previous government of Hafez al-Assad, I think, had paved the way so that it could ensure a stability vis-a-vis the current regime. Bashar al-Assad and its army, I think, demonstrated from the very beginning that this was not an easy case. And even though we talk about the double veto that it was exercised by both Russia and China back in 2015, when somehow he was seeking for support, until that time still, we could talk about a very strong structure, a long-lasting army. And this is the case because in the past, Syria spent maybe almost 80% of its budget in defense. You should not be underestimated this. But at the same time, this sort of strength, it was very much related to the fact that the previous government of Hafez al-Assad was very clever enough in order not to wage any war and to protect its own territory, even in the peak of crisis like in the 1998. And this, I think, is a very good lesson for today's politics that it is perpetuating in the way they do. And a very big lesson in the sense that it does not matter really in the end of the day what you are trying to communicate, to demonstrate as an image, as an impression, whether powerful or not. But what it really matters is your strategic calculations that can lead you to long-term survival, especially in contexts. They are very tough, very strict, and it's not guaranteed that the majority of the citizenship supports A or B exercise of power. So this is one. The Kurds in Syria, they did, I think, a miracle since 2012 onwards in Rojava, Kurdistan. The fact that they have been able to safeguard security-wise such long borders, I think it's something which is unique. We're talking again about entities with far less of recognition in terms of, within and outside, but they were able to form relations with state entities and become co-partners. Everybody, I think, is recognizing the role of the YPG, of the Kurds in Syria overall, because obviously it's not just consisted of Kurds, the SDF forces, also other entities that they really gave a prolonged battle and they succeeded. They succeeded based on the means that they had, based on the realities that they could be identified by, without airstrikes, without. The maybe only problem to some extent, and then it was that maybe Berda was not able to demonstrate clearly these fine lines of difference, even in ideological terms. I have written back in 2015 an article in Third World Quarterly with regards to that. So they were not able maybe to perform these ideological differences and capitalize on the great achievement on their part, of course. When it came to the progression of the events, and later, of course, we had sort of their identification with PKK, and then all these different sort of stories. But of course, always there are limitations when it comes to any entity, either state and non-state. The fact that we're talking about an occupied land right now by Turkey, which I guess is not even accepted by the UN Charter, is something which is another complication within there. At the same time, I believe that even the regime of Bashar al-Assad might not be very happy with Turkish and Iranian influences, direct Turkish and Iranian influence on the Syrian soil. I think this is also, I imagine this also would not be something very pleasant. And as far as the survival of the regime, I think this has been proven and continues to be the case. I don't think that Syria, it is another Middle Eastern country like Iraq, because each of all these different entities, they are characterized by their own features. And in the case of Syria, I think we're talking about a completely different structure. The sectarianism was not part of the construction of Syria. And I think even though that sometime throughout the war was trying somehow to be cultivated domestically, was not very successful. However, today I think we have a concrete reality. Still, we're talking about a self-administrated territory. We are talking about the perpetuation of the power of the survival of Bashar al-Assad, which is a fact. But overall, I'm not sure the extent to which really we can further comment on Syria, on the Kurds, on the Arabs, and so forth, when we are talking about a land that it has been also under occupation. I think Syria has really to somehow clear from any sort of regional interferences, in order then the Syrians per se, either Kurds or Arabs, they're able to sit on the table of the negotiations and discuss. Because in the end, I think it's the triumph of the citizens of X country or Y if they are able to come together and decide anything within their own context. All the rest, I think, still we're talking about a very sort of particularly complicated situation, only because we're talking also about an occupied part.
The last question for today's interview, and I know it's a bit complicated, but is it possible to describe the main goals of Kurds? I know they are living in different countries as a minority, but overall, like, are there any main goals that we should memorize and maybe we should research as scholars in the near future? Because I think that even those people, they live in different countries. Something must unite them.
Obviously, I cannot speak on behalf of the Kurds. Maybe a Kurdish politician would be much more ideal to respond to this question. But I think politically, the only, I think, reality that remains, and it will continue to remain because we are talking about an entity of 36 or 40, it doesn't matter, it's a very big number of people, is, I think, the need for a constitutional, maybe in any form, recognition of their presence and of their status. I think that's pretty much straightforward. And it was a reality that it was just only missed from this artifact which is called Middle East. Middle Eastern borders have been constructed. There was an Arabian Peninsula. There were never countries A, B, C, D along with this sort of Westphalian European sort of state system. And the biggest proof is that within each of these territories, we're talking about multi-ethnic reality, multi-ethnic composition that, for instance, the Kurds in Syria understood very well. That's why I think their paradigm, if we can call it like this, up to a certain extent, it was successful because they understood when they didn't call the SDF forces Kurdish forces, because it was not the case. It doesn't matter, majority, minority, which is another term under, of course, consideration, but they understood that we are talking about multi-ethnic societies. Of course, in the territories that traditionally Kurds outnumber, and as we said, indigenous population, I think it's normal on their behalf to ask for constitutional recognition, whatever this means.
Marianna, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and very interesting ideas about Kurds, because I think this topic is slightly under-researched, and I think we should invest more energy and resources for some projects about Kurds and Kurds living in different countries. As you said, it's a multi-ethnic question, and perhaps we should go back to history to reveal how people lived together in the past and what sort of lessons we can learn from the history. Anyway, thank you very much for being on IR Thinker.
Thanks for having me.